This episode of the Creep Street Podcast is brought to you by Martini Coffee Roasters. You know, people always look at me weird when I say I start off every morning with a big old martini. But then I set them straight, and I tell them I'm talking about Martini Coffee Roasters coffee. A delicious coffee made by the Martini family. They roast their coffee using a traditional method of sight and sound to roast those little babies to perfection. And they also sell green coffee beans for those home roasters out there. And right now, fans of the Creep Street Podcast can get 20% off their entire order by using the code CREEPSTREET at martinicoffee.com. Once again, for 20% off your order, use the code CREEPSTREET at martinicoffee.com. Martini Coffee Roasters, the perfect coffee to keep you creeps caffeinated.
You've taken a wrong turn down Creep Street.
Citizens of the Milky Way, this is Maureen Bogey.
And this is Dylan Hackworth.
And you are listening to the Creep Street Podcast. What is it? What is it? What is it?
I smell a delicious episode in the horizon.
Oh my God. I thought that was Banshee. That was you?
Put on your bibs, folks. Put on your bibs. Put a little something. Make sure because it's a mess. It's messy but delicious.
Oh yeah.
It's like eating ribs.
It's finger licking good.
Oh yeah.
Oh yeah. You know how it is.
Get some wet wipes.
Yikes. Now everyone, thank you so much for being here today. And if you are a fan of the show, please like, rate, subscribe, leave a review, leave 5 stars. We love to see it. Now, if you also, want to keep up on what we're doing, on social media, you can follow us on, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, Threads, end of list at Creep Street Podcast. And then for Twitter, you can head on over to Creep Street Pod. And you know what? If one episode a week is not enough, if you need more, okay, which you probably do.
Oh, yeah. The first taste is always free.
Oh, that's right. That's right. You can head on over to patreon.com/Creep Street Podcast. And there you can get all sorts of bonus content from movie reviews to movie commentaries to short stories to interviews to conversations to full bonus episodes. Okay, we got some good stuff popping off over there, so you can check that out at patreon.com/Creep Street Podcast. Now, last week was a lot for me.
Yes, it was. Good golly.
I mean, wow. Wow. What a wild ride that was. Thank you to everyone who has listened, for your kind words, all of that. If you haven't listened to our last episode, the Kraken Sea Monsters, What's Kraken? Go ahead, give that a listen. But today we're not at sea today, I don't believe.
No, in fact, folks, we are on land. In fact, we are headed deep into the mountains of Scotland's Highlands.
Okay. All right. You know what? I'm excited to be here. Dylan, take it away.
Folks, today's episode is The Grey Man of Ben Macdhui. Like one that on a lonesome road doth walk in fear and dread, and having once turned round walks on, and turns no more his head, because he knows a frightful fiend doth close behind him tread. Samuel Taylor Coleridge, Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner, 1834. Oh, baby, bundle up.
Okay.
Because we are going into the cold, foggy peaks of the Cairngorm mountain range of Scotland, folks.
Whoa.
I am so excited to dive into this topic. I'm super excited specifically about this story because I first heard of the Gray Man of Ben Macdhui. By the way, I've heard it pronounced Ben Macdhui and Ben Macdhu, so I think it's Dewey. For the longest time I said Macdhu, but if I'm wrong and I was right the first time, I'm going to feel like a dumb asshole.
Who knows? I mean, it's you just got in life. You got to take chances.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's a 50-50.
Well, the first time, as I was saying, I had heard of the Gray Man was on the Blurry Photos podcast nearly a decade ago. I think it was a 2014 episode, so like 9 years ago.
Wow.
And the Gray Man is often described as sort of like Scotland's Bigfoot. I'm not sure on that specifically. Maybe I'll agree by the time this episode is done. But first, let's talk about Ben Macdhui.
Okay.
The mountain, Ben Macdhui. It's actually, like I said, a mountain in the Cairngorm mountain range. It is the second tallest mountain in Scotland and the second tallest mountain in all of the British Isles, as a matter of fact. Second only to the mountain named Ben Nevis. I think it's Nevis or Nevis. Ben Macdhui is actually Scottish Gaelic for Macduff's Mountain.
Oh.
Ben Macdhui stands at 4,295 feet above sea level, and it is located in Scotland's Eastern Highlands between the towns of Aberdeenshire and Moray. Oftentimes, a mist encircles the mountain, instantly giving it an ethereal feeling. And that's why it is the perfect place for the central figure of today's episode. It is said that this very mountain is haunted by an entity known as the Gray Man. But in Gaelic, he is known as the Amphir Liathmar. Obviously, I don't know how to speak Gaelic, so if I didn't say that right, I'm sure I didn't. I very much apologize, but
it's tough.
It is kind of a dope name, though.
Yeah, oh yeah.
The Amphir Liathmar.
I like it.
Now, the legend of the Gray Man has been around for hundreds of years. One of the earliest reported encounters with the Gray Man occurred in 1791, and the experience happened to famed Scottish poet James Hogg. Now, Hogg was tending to some sheep in the area, making his way through the dense fog. He took a moment to catch his breath, and he took in the sight of the foggy beauty surrounding him. As we know, the Scottish Highlands, people say, is some of the most beautiful landscape in the world.
Oh, yeah, I want to see it.
I can imagine that the fog, it just adds this mystique, and it just sounds so, it sounds like a poem come to life, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Well, he's taking in this beauty around him, and that's when he notices a movement in the fog. And then he could hear what sounded like a faint rumble approaching him in the distance. The sheep began to stir, and he did his best to calm them. That's when the entity appeared before him. And by appear, let me just clarify. From what I understand is that even though this being was close to Hogg, the entity remained somewhat shrouded in the fog, but the outline of the shadow of the entity was plain to see. Hogg was even quoted saying, "I was actually struck powerless with astonishment and fear." He claimed that the thing was at least 30 feet in height, and what he referred to as equally proportioned, which I think he means even though it was big, the head and limbs, they were all equal in proportion, obviously. I think most of us get that, but I just wanted to clarify. Hogg apparently returned to the site of his encounter the very next day. He wanted to know if what he had seen was real or if he was just losing his mind. Once again, apparently the massive Gray Man appeared, and he walked directly up to James Hogg. It took every fiber in this man's being, as you would imagine, not to turn and run like mad. Hogg, thinking on his feet, decided to take off his hat as a sign of respect. And to his surprise, the Gray Man did the same thing and matched his polite gesture. Here is something that is just wild to me. Hogg returned home that day, believing that what he had seen was simply his shadow in the fog. The fact that the entity took off his hat, mimicking what he did, made him believe it was just his shadow. Now, there is an actual phenomenon that is like this that we will discuss later, but if you ask me personally, I think it was just a way to help him cope with his experience, but who knows?
Okay.
But after this 1791 encounter was when the legend of the Gray Man went mainstream. Over the next several years, there would be many claimed sightings of this entity, and descriptions of it would vary greatly as well. For example, many of the encounters described the Gray Man as being around 10 feet tall or larger, with almost an ape-like appearance, hence the Bigfoot aspect of this. The body, they claimed, was covered in a coat of short gray fur. In some accounts, they describe the creature as wearing a long, dark coat and top hat. But despite the many variations in looks, one thing was constant in every encounter. Every witness claimed a feeling of unease and terror that would almost come in waves. They would feel it before they even saw this thing, this feeling that something in the fog was watching them. And this feeling would linger with them long after their encounter. Some would even claim to hear strange, ethereal music playing in the air when the entity was near.
Interesting. So they would hear music.
Yes, and that is something that is often reported with this entity. By the way, I realized I didn't mention my sources. I will do that at the end. How about that?
Yeah, we love doing that at the end sometimes.
Yeah, I just simply forgot, so I'll just do it at the end this time.
Yeah.
I was just so goddamn excited about this story.
Who could blame you? But yeah, the music thing, I don't know, that's just an interesting thing because a part of that seems kind of maybe a little unbelievable to me. Maybe it's a little too movie-like, a little too perfect.
Interesting, okay.
But at the same time, these beings, just because they are not human, does not mean that they are just completely, devoid of any kind of I don't really even know what I'm saying.
No. I understand what you're saying.
That it's like, it seems like it would be unbelievable, but at the same time, like, why not? These things, if they're from another place, we'll say, makes sense that maybe they would elicit some sort of a sensical reaction. And by sensical, that's not really the right word, but that's just felt good to say. I mean, like, it uses all of your senses to have a reaction.
Yeah. In fact, let me just read a quote directly from my source about that. This is a bit impromptu. I actually hadn't added this to my notes, but let me just read this brief paragraph.
Please do.
This is from one of my sources called The Big Gray Man of Ben Macdhui by Affleck Gary. I will state that again at the end when I read the sources, but this is a quote about that directly from the source. Strange sounds of music and singing are frequently heard in mountain country. To those who have an intimacy with the high tops and corries, they are recognized for what, generally speaking, they are. The pleasure derived from them is exquisite. To others, they cause dismay and sometimes fear. Curiously, some never hear them at all. Interesting.
Okay. Yeah.
Is this something that comes from the Gray Man or just the mountain itself?
Yes, I love that. And it kind of makes sense. This is the land of the British Isles. It's like all about that kind of classic, fairies. We're talking elves. We're talking all of these things that, kind of have associations with music too. So I don't know. Why not?
Absolutely. And, perhaps if you wanted to theorize, perhaps it is these frequencies, these notes. Like it said, some people can't hear them. Like how some people can hear certain frequencies and some can't. Maybe that is what elicits this fear. Maybe it's not necessarily music, but some sort of a frequency that gives you that feeling.
Right.
Well, now let's jump forward about 115 years. And let's talk about a man named Hugh Welsh, briefly. The year was 1904, and Welsh was working as a biologist. He and his brother were out on Ben Macdhui collecting plant and animal samples for his work. They were always out there, and they had long heard the legend of the creature that haunted the mountain that they were on very often. Welsh even said that they had often heard what sounded like huge, thundering footsteps somewhere in the fog in the area. Yet they were never able to actually get a direct look at this thing. But they didn't have to see the creature to feel that strange sense of dread in the pit of their stomachs. Now we jump ahead to J. Norman Colley and Dr. A.M. Kellis. One of the most well-known encounters with the Gray Man happened in 1891 to a man, as I just said, named J. Norman Colley. And let's get one thing clear here. Colley was a very highly regarded mountaineer. And on top of being a dope-ass mountain climber, he was a celebrated professor of organic chemistry at the University College in London, as well as a fellow of the Royal Society.
Okay.
Well, it was a foggy day, as was usual at Ben Macdhui, and Colley was making a trek on the mountain. Somewhere along the way, he began to get that feeling of unease. And the farther he went, this sense of impending danger only grew in his stomach. That's when he began to hear what sounded like the treading of very heavy footprints behind him. It was like someone was following him in the mist. Every time Collie would stop and turn to look behind him, there would be no one there. What happened on the mountain that day was something that Collie kept secret for many years. In fact, it was 21 years later on November 28, 1925, when Collie was giving a speech at the 27th annual general meeting of the Cairngorm Club. It was here he mentioned his faithful experience that day back in 1904 on Ben Macdhui. I began to think I heard something else than merely the noise of my own footsteps. For every few steps I took, I heard a crunch, and then another crunch, as if someone was walking after me, but taking steps 3 or 4 times the length of my own. I said to myself, this is all nonsense. I listened and heard it again, but could see nothing in the mist. As I walked on, and the eerie crunch sounded behind me, I was seized with terror and took to my heels, staggering blindly among the boulders for 4 or 5 miles, nearly down to Rothiemurchus Forest. Whatever you make of it, I do not know, but there is something very queer about the top of Ben Macdhui, and I will not go back there again by myself, I know. Now, given that Collie was such a well-respected climber and professor, this really gave the legend a bit of legitimacy. It essentially put on a tie and combed its hair.
Oh, come on.
You know what I'm saying.
Yeah.
In fact, Collie sharing his story was the fuel to get another well-respected individual to come out about their encounter with the Gray Man. This man was a chemistry teacher by the name of Dr. A.M. Callis.
Oh, another chemistry guy.
I know, good golly. He was also on Ben Macdhui one day with his brother. He claims that all of a sudden, a figure standing at least 10 feet tall came charging out of the fog directly at them. And then, as mysteriously as it appeared, the thing vanished before their very eyes. Both men were so terrified they took off running. The whole while, they felt like the beast was hot on their heels, and the sightings would only continue on without stop. Another incredible encounter with the Gray Man happened in 1939, and it was chronicled by an adventurer named Alistair Borthwick. He went on to write about this experience in a book entitled Always a Little Further. Now, the encounter actually happened to 2 friends of his who were also climbers. He was just retelling the story in his book. But the 2 climbers, as the story goes, were climbing on the mountain when they began to feel that creeping sense of fear that many always report feeling before the Gray Man encounter. They couldn't shake this feeling that they were being followed by something out there in the mist. Here is an excerpt from his book about the situation. The first was alone, heading over Macdhui for Cora on a night when the snow had a hard, crisp crust through which his boots broke at every step. He reached the summit, and it was while he was descending the slopes which fall towards the Lairg that he heard footsteps behind him. Footsteps not in the rhythm of his own, but occurring only once every 3 steps he took. I felt a queer crinkling feeling in the back of my neck, he told me, but I said to myself, this is silly. There must be a reason for it. So I stopped, and the footsteps stopped, and I sat down and tried to reason it out. I could see nothing. There was a moon about somewhere, but the mist was fairly thick. The only thing I could make of it was that when my boots broke through the snow crust, they made some sort of echo. But then every step should have echoed, and not just this regular 1 in 3. I was scared stiff. I got up and walked on, trying hard not to look behind me. I got down all right. The footsteps stopped 1,000 feet above the Lairg, and I didn't run. But if anything had so much as said boo behind me, I'd have been down to Cora like a streak of lightning. The second man's experience was roughly similar. He was on Macdhui and alone. He heard footsteps. He was climbing in daylight in summer, but so dense was the mist that he was working by compass, and visibility was almost as poor as it would have been at night. The footsteps he heard were made by something or someone trudging up the fine screes which decorate the upper parts of the mountain, a thing not extraordinary in itself, though the steps were only a few yards behind him, but exceedingly odd when the mist suddenly cleared and he could see no living thing on the mountain, at that point devoid of cover of any kind. Did the footsteps follow yours exactly? I asked him. No, he said. That was the funny thing. They didn't. They were regular all right, but the queer thing was that they seemed to come once for every 2.5 steps I took. He thought it queer still when I told him the other man's story. You see, he was long-legged and 6 feet tall, and the first man was only 5 feet 7. Once I was out with a search party on Macdhui, and on the way down after an unsuccessful day, I asked some of the gameskeepers and stalkers who were with us what they thought of it all. They worked on Macdhui, so they should know. Had they seen Fairless Moor? Did he exist, or was it just a silly story? They looked at me for a few seconds, and then one said, "We do not talk about that." So very interesting. I also like, because you would think, oh, it's probably just echoes of these footsteps. But I love how they mention specifically it was about 1 in every 3 they would hear, or 1 in every, depending on how long your legs were. And it makes me think of Jurassic Park when you would hear the in the distance when the T-Rex was approaching. Because it's so big, it steps, there's more time in between.
Right.
I thought was really interesting tidbit.
Yeah, a very good detail.
It really paints the eerie feeling. It makes me think you're probably sitting at your camp, and almost like Jurassic Park, you would hear this doof, doof, and it would, I can imagine the pit that you would feel in your stomach. God.
Yeah, it's footsteps that you've never really heard from a person before.
Exactly.
Because it's not.
And it's so foggy you can't really see,
Ooh, so scary.
And, even though it might sound like it's coming from behind you, oftentimes because of the mountain range, it might bounce around. You might not know where the noise is coming from, only that it's getting closer.
Oh, that's so scary.
Well, hopping forward to 1940, a Scottish author by the name R. MacDonald Robertson was camping on the mountain with a friend and a dog. The two and their canine friend had bedded down for the night and had fallen asleep. But suddenly, during the night, the men were awakened by the sound of their dog barking and growling like mad. That's when the men began to hear the thud of heavy approaching footsteps. They heard them get louder, and then it was like whatever it was had passed by them in the fog and faded into the distance. As time passed, the dog settled back down and fell to sleep. Then, in 1942, a climber named Sidney Scroggie was climbing on the mountain when he had a weird experience. On the mountainside, he claimed to have seen, quote, "a tall, stately human figure appear out of the blackness on one side of the loch, and clearly silhouetted against the water, paced with long, deliberate steps across the combined burns just where they enter the loch." Yet, no evidence of these footprints could be found. Jumping ahead now to 1945.
Okay, jumping all over.
A mountaineer named Peter Densham was out on the mountain when he started to have that sense of terror that we've all heard about, boiling up in his belly. And in 1948, another climber named Richard Freer was climbing on Ben Macdhui when he described feeling the unmistakable presence of someone lurking in the fog nearby. He would describe the feeling as, quote, "a presence utterly abstract but intensely real." I like that quote. Utterly abstract, but intensely real.
And that's how these moments feel, is because, not that I've had anything this intense, of course, I've experienced myself. I can imagine from what I have experienced in my life, and according to, other things I've read and listened to and whatnot, that even though what you're experiencing is unlike anything you've ever experienced before, it feels more real and more now than anything else has ever felt.
Absolutely. Well, Freer was in his tent when he began to feel that feeling of dread. He worked up the courage to poke his head out of his tent to have a look, and he witnessed a hulking mass that stood at least 20 feet tall. He claimed it was brownish in color and seemed to have immense strength. He watched as under the moonlight it walked away from the direction of the camp he had set up. What's also strange is that Freer also reported being able to hear a strange ethereal music in the air, a sort of echoing pipe music. Very interesting.
Yes, and very apropos that it's the pipe music as well. Hello?
I mean, come on.
But I don't know, that detail itself is so interesting to me, is that they're hearing music. It's like, are there others of these things that are playing music? Or is it they elicit this music? Or that's just a part of the realm that these people are kind of in when they experience these things? I don't know.
Yeah. Maybe it is. Maybe it's the sign of some sort of dimensional flap or something.
Right, yeah.
In 1958, the Scots magazine published an account of a witness, a naturalist and adventurer named Alexander Tunian. He had an experience back in 1943, and here's what he wrote about it.
In October 1943, I spent a 10-day leave climbing alone in the Cairngorms. One afternoon, just as I reached the summit cairn of Ben Macdhui, mist swirled across the Lairg grew and enveloped the mountain. The atmosphere became dark and oppressive. A fierce, bitter wind whisked among the boulders, and an odd sound echoed through the mist. A loud footstep, it seemed. Then another and another. A strange shape loomed up, receded, and came charging at me. Without hesitation, I whipped out the revolver and fired 3 times at the figure. When it still came on, I turned and headed down the path, reaching Glenderry in a time that I have never bettered. You may ask, was it really the fair Leith Moor? Frankly, I think it was.
Wow, goodness gracious, he even fired 3 shots at this motherfucker.
Yeah,
And it kept coming, baby.
Yeah.
He got his ass down to Glenderry in record time, baby. Call him Barry Allen, because I think he was the Flash that day.
Come on.
Well, the sightings just kept rolling in as the decades went by. In the 1990s, 3 witnesses had an interesting encounter while on the mountain. They were hiking when they were shocked to see what looked like a dark, human-like creature running with incredible speed across the trail in front of them. Each of them were hit with a sense of dread. As they got closer to the area where they saw the thing run across the trail, one of the witnesses screamed when they saw what was a face looking at them from the branches of the trees. They described this being saying, quote, human, but not human. One of them worked up the nerve to throw a stone at it, and it retreated back into the forest. But they would soon regret that move when later, as they were leaving, the creature burst out of the forest and chased their vehicle. According to the witnesses, the thing was able to keep up with them in their vehicle up to about a speed of 45 miles an hour.
Oh my God.
So it's it reminds, even though it doesn't look anything like a T-Rex, it reminds me of I keep getting flashes of the T-Rex from Jurassic
Right,
Park.
especially because, in the car. And,
exactly, and
yeah.
they run after him and Jeff Goldblum's in the back. Yeah, it makes me think of that.
Yeah. Ooh, wow. That's so frightening to think of something being able to keep up with your car. Like right when you get in your car and you think you're safe and we're going to drive away from this thing, and it can keep up with you for so long.
I know.
Oof, that's scary.
In 2004, a Scottish ghost hunter named Tom Robertson was in the area when him and his partner saw what they described as a 10-foot-tall figure standing next to their tent. They described it looking like a big gray gorilla. They watched it knock over their tent with a single swipe of its hand like it was nothing more than a gingerbread house. The men ran out of there, coming across huge footprints as they did. Then in 2005, a witness named Peter George had an encounter, of which he said,
Out of the corner of my eye, over to the left towards the stream, I caught a glimpse of a tall gray figure. At first, I thought it was one of our party, although all of them were inside the bothy. I turned to look properly and couldn't see anymore.
Well, the very next year, in June of 2006, 2 men, a man named Stephen Pedler and his father Roy, were out on the mountain when they began to hear the sound of heavy footsteps approaching from somewhere in the fog. It sounded like the thing was behind them, like it was following them. A few months later, in September of that year, an anonymous witness posted of their encounter on Ben Macdhui saying, quote,
I was climbing back down Ben Macdhui in May of 1988 when I experienced the footsteps phenomenon mentioned by others. It was pretty misty and I was alone, but it was like something was behind me, only 10 meters or so, keeping track of me. I backtracked to see if anyone was there. I didn't see anything. But it was weird enough to scare me, particularly as the sounds occurred both when I was moving or stationary. It was only after I told this story to a Glasgow cousin years later that I first heard about the Grey Man.
So as you can see, the stories don't stop. There's countless stories of encounters with the Grey Man, but let's talk about theories, huh?
Oh yeah, please, because I want to know what people are thinking. I want to know, is this as highly or regarded as a Bigfoot, or is this totally different? I don't know. I'm curious here.
Yeah. Well, since Collie, the man we talked about earlier, since he first revealed his encounter in November of 1925 in Aberdeen, countless theories have been put forth trying to explain these supernatural encounters. Now, a publication named the Press and Journal released a story on Colley's encounter on November 30th, 1925. And then in another edition soon after, released in December 3rd, they released a collection of opinions that were given from other climbers about what they thought of Colley's story.
Okay.
I'm only going to include one, but as you can imagine, there were people that agreed, that were like, I've experienced the same thing. There were some that thought it was bullshit, and of course there were some that were like, who knows?
Oh, yeah.
But I wanted to quote this real quick because the first story that was published on November 30th started with a little poem about the Gray Man.
I saw him once, I saw him twice. 'Tis said you dare not see him thrice. He wanders on the mountain height, a ghostly form, a fearsome sight, the big gray man of Big Macdhui. The big gray man, he stood as high as yonder cairn against the sky. I quailed before the spectre grim, he vanished through the twilight dim, the big gray man of Ben Macdhui. The mountain mist had me in thrall, but now I heard his footsteps fall. Crunching the snow upon the hill, I heard him follow still. The big gray man of Ben Macdhui. Uncanny was the crunching sound. I fled like deer before the hound. Behind I do not dare to look. To my 4 steps, 1 stride he took. The big gray man of Ben Macdhui. At last I left behind the snow, and came into the woods I know. That eerie mount I'll climb no more, content to see through legend lore. The big gray man of Ben Macdhui.
It only attributes the poem to a HH, so...
Okay.
Well, one of the first to express their opinions about Colley's story was a climber, a very accomplished climber, named Robert Clark, who had been climbing in the Cairngorm mountain range for over 40 years.
Jeez.
So very experienced guy. The first time Clark had heard the legend was in a book called The Highlands with Rope and Rucksack, written by a Dr. Ernest A. Baker, published in 1924, a year before Colley revealed his story. In the book, he tells of having an eerie feeling like someone was following him on the mountain. So Clark was somewhat familiar with the legend and expressed that he had always had a belief in such things as spirits and otherworldly creatures. Of Dr. Colley's encounter, he said, quote,
One likes to think that there is really a mountain spirit, benign and beautiful, unseen, but ever ready to bless the true worshipper at her shrine, and in this fine faith one may well rest content.
And like I said, some believed, some didn't. Who knows?
Yeah.
But what is the Gray Man? Is he, or is it sort of like is it simply a flesh and blood creature that is yet to be discovered?
Right.
It's exactly the same arguments we have about Bigfoot here.
Yeah.
Is it simply a flesh and blood animal? Is it something supernatural? Is it interdimensional, extraterrestrial? Well, there is a kind of interesting extraterrestrial connection here.
Okay.
A group, and this, I believed we talked about this group briefly in our episode about the Unarians. The cult of Unarius. I think so. Because I know I've read about this group, but we haven't done an episode proper on them.
Okay.
This group is called the Aetherius Society, and it was led by a man named George King, sometimes referred to as the Reverend Dr. George King. It's funny because in my source, it kept saying Dr. King said he saw this, and it was like, totally like, well, that seems a little inappropriate, baby.
And also the Reverend Doctor, too.
I know. It was so funny because, like, it's, and then the Dr. King says the Gray Men took him on their it was just so, like...
Insane.
So insane. Well, his whole thing, the Aetherius Society, started off in England, and like I said, we will cover the Aetherius Society in depth in a future episode because they were a cult all their own. Very wacky, interesting, creepy stuff.
Oh, okay. Hell yeah.
So I'm just going to kind of skim the information about the group because we'll save that for that episode. But
yeah.
George had actually been a taxi driver until sometime in the 1950s. He claimed he was made aware that he was, quote, the primary mental channel of the space intelligences. And in 1958, George claimed that he happened to meet Jesus on a hill in North Devon, England called Holdstone Hill. Here is what he said about it.
A stream of energy was sent through me out into the world and also into the very rocks below my feet. Holdstone Down had become a holy mountain. Operation Starlight had begun.
Consider that a little teaser for that episode.
Oh, yeah.
But anyway, George King later claimed to have traveled to some of the greatest mountains all over the world with a team of, mountaineers, some of the world's finest. And he was seeking out which specific mountains were touched by cosmic significance. One of the mountains he claimed was special was one called Creek an Lithchoin, which stands at 3,448 feet above sea level. Keep in mind, like I said, I'm sure I pronounced that wrong, but I'm very sorry. But this mountain is only about 3 miles northwest of Ben Macdhui, so right nearby. On September 9th, 1961, George King claimed he was contacted by a member of a group called the Great White Brotherhood. Sounds problematic.
Yeah, you hate to hear it, yeah.
Sounds a little problematic, but he claimed he was allowed to participate in one of their sacred retreats. He says he was led down into the bowels of Ben Macdhui, where there was a great giant dome-shaped auditorium where there were many other beings. They were working with some sort of machine that was unlike anything George had seen and what he described as being impossible to be imagined by the human mind.
Oh.
But the purpose of this machine, from what he was able to interpret, was the machine calculated all the good that every religion in the world, big and small, had produced. And apparently they've included some of George's work.
Oh.
Of course! He claims that Earth was on the verge of a sort of cosmic initiation, which is not unheard of in many UFO stories we've covered. But essentially, many think the Gray Man might be one of these cosmic beings that is a part of the Great White Brotherhood.
Oh, wow.
Now this is interesting. And I'm going to quote my source directly here. I don't know much about Buddhism, but I know a little bit, but I know there's different schools of thought, like any major philosophy or religion. But this was interesting. Here's a quote. This is a paragraph from my source.
The belief is resolutely held among some followers of the Buddhist or allied religion in this country that Ben Macdhui is the haunt of a particularly holy or perfect being of the Buddhist faith, and that levitated Tibetan lamas regularly met in a cave on Ben Macdhui to discuss the destinies of the world.
Oh my God. That would be wild.
I just thought that was interesting.
That is very interesting. If we have any listeners out there that are Buddhist or maybe, know more about Buddhism and have any kind of insight here, reach out and let us know what's going on.
And of course, skeptics have many theories, ranging from the witnesses either making a mistake, mistaking what they saw with a different animal or creature, or even that they're making it all up. But there's actually one natural explanation that I had never thought of. I had known it was a thing, but I didn't know it had a name.
Okay.
Keep in mind, I'm not saying that I think this is what it was.
Right.
But just for the sake of a skeptic's argument, I thought this one was pretty interesting.
Yeah.
There's apparently an atmospheric phenomenon known as broken specters. And from what I understand, this is essentially when light hits a person just right and an outline of their image is reflected on fog. And sometimes it'll be towering, like very tall. So one might think their reflection is a monster in the fog. Think about the James Hogg, who took his hat off as a sign of respect, and the shadow did the same thing.
Right.
And remember, however, many of these encounters happened in the dead of night, when there would be no light to reflect on the fog.
Right.
And like many things, it's probably a case of, was this the case for some people? Maybe, sure.
Yeah.
And even, was there some people who lied?
Sure. I'm sure, yeah.
But then are there people who legitimately saw this thing or something supernatural? Then yes.
I mean, yeah.
I mean, it doesn't have to all be one thing.
Right.
And I know that this is because I remember, there's been times, if you ever, on a foggy night, ever gotten out of a car with the headlights still on, if you're in front of the car, your shadow will get projected on the fog of night, and it'll look big. So I've seen something like it before.
Right.
And so it is like a thing.
Can that answer every single experience is the question.
Exactly.
Especially what people have, heard with the footsteps and the music and the whole thing.
Exactly, Maureen.
And I'm also interested in just, we've mentioned it time and time again, the kind of connection with mountains and caves and caverns and things like that can really be home to paranormal activity or can increase paranormal activity. I don't know. but there's something there too.
Absolutely.
But Dylan, thank you for doing all of that amazing research and putting together a lovely episode. And I think you've got some sources to read.
Yes, before we wrap up, let me, of course, mention my sources, and I'm so sorry I didn't do it at the beginning. I've been so excited to tell this damn tale.
I mean, I've done it a million times.
So I have a few sources here. One was a book called The Big Gray Man of Ben Macdhui by Affleck Gary. And then, of course, a little dose of Brent Swanser, an article called The Mysterious Big Gray Man of Scotland at Mysterious Universe, another article called The Gray Man of Ben Macdhui by John May, and a video on YouTube called Scottish Bigfoot, The Big Gray Man of Ben Macdhui by a channel called Dr. Polaris.
That is some good stuff, Dylan. Thank you so much again for doing all of that.
Of course.
But now I think there's something else you got to read off.
Oh, that's right. Folks, I got a list of names I wouldn't mind following me in the fog. Give it on up for our top-tier Patreon subscribers. Of course, the Dream James Watkins, the Finnish Face Fiat Lundqvist, the Madman Marcus Hall, the Vivacious Vicky McHugh, the Tenacious Teresa Hackworth, the Heartbreak Kid, Chris Hackworth, the Oh-So-Suave Sean Richardson, the British Bone Breaker Bex Martin, the Notorious Nicholas Barker, the Terrifying Taylor Lashmet, the Count of Cool Cameron Corliss, the Archduke of Attitude Adam Archer, the Sinister Sam Kiker, the Nightmare of New Zealand Noeline Vivilli, the Loathsome Johnny Love, the Carnivorous Kevin Bogey, the Killer Stud Carl Staub, the Firestarter Heather Carter, the Conqueror Christopher Damian Damaris, the Awfully Awesome Annie, the Murderous Maggie Leach, the Sir of Sexy Sam Hackworth, the Evil Elizabeth Riley, Lauren Hellfire Hernandez Lopez, the Maniacal Laura Maynard, the Vicious Karen Van Buren, the Arch Nemesis Aaron Bird, the Sadistic Sergio Castillo, the Rapscallion Ryan Crum, the Beast Benjamin Huang, the Devilish Chris Doucette, the Psycho Sam, the Electric Emily Zhang, the Renegade Corey Ramos, the Crazed Carlos, the Antagonist Andrew Park, the Monstrous Michaela Schur, the Witchy Wonder J.P. Weimer, the Freaky Ben Forsyth, the Barbaric Andrew Barry, and the Mysterious Marcella.
Whoa, thank you so much for listing off those names. Thank you so much to our top tier. Wow. We are so, so grateful for you. Thank you to all of our Patreon subscribers. And thank you all for joining us today and listening. Gosh darn it, you are the best. And please remember to leave us a review. Give us those 5 stars. Share us on social media. Tell your friend about us. Tell your coworker about us. We got to spread that good word of Creep Street, baby. We got big things brewing, and we're excited to have you here with us.
Citizens of the Milky Way, my name is Dylan Hackworth.
I'm Maureen Bogey.
Good night and goodbye.
Goodbye.